On January 10, 2026, the United States Department of Justice did something no administration has ever done in the history of the Federal Reserve. They served the central bank with grand jury subpoenas threatening to criminally indict the chairman for setting interest rates. The official justification is a building renovation that went over budget. The actual target is the independence of the institution that controls the American economy. This isn't about Jerome Powell. This is about whether any federal institution can resist presidential pressure without facing criminal prosecution. Right now, mainstream media is debating whether Powell lied to Congress about construction costs, whether a $2.5 billion renovation was mismanaged, whether Trump knew about the investigation or didn't. That's missing the entire point. The real story is what Jerome Powell said in an unprecedented video statement released Sunday night. He didn't just defend himself. He directly accused the Trump administration of using criminal threats to force the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates against its economic judgment. Quote, "The threat of criminal charges is a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public, rather than following the preferences of the president." That's not a defense against criminal allegations. That's an accusation of institutional coercion using the Justice Department as the weapon. Let me walk you through what actually happened, because the timeline reveals this wasn't about building costs. This was about breaking institutional resistance. The Federal Reserve is designed to be independent from political control. That's not a tradition, it's structural. The Fed chair serves a 4-year term that doesn't align with presidential terms. The president can't fire the chair. The Fed doesn't depend on congressional appropriations. It funds itself through its own operations. Why? Because monetary policy requires making unpopular decisions. Raising interest rates to fight inflation hurts growth in the short term. Lowering rates too fast can create bubbles and instability. Politicians want easy money before elections. The Fed is supposed to resist that pressure. Jerome Powell was appointed by Trump in his first term. For years, Trump has attacked him publicly, called him incompetent, a numbskull, a dumb guy, demanded lower interest rates to boost the economy and the stock market. The Fed has been cutting rates. They've cut at the last 3 meetings, but not as aggressively as Trump wants. Trump wants dramatic cuts. The Fed is moving cautiously based on inflation data and economic indicators. That's the core conflict. Trump wants political control of monetary policy. The Fed insists on setting rates based on economics. July 2025. Trump tours the Federal Reserve headquarters renovation project with Powell. In front of reporters, Trump criticizes the cost overruns. Powell corrects him on the actual numbers. The tension between them is visible. Summer 2025. The DOJ begins investigating Lisa Cook, a Federal Reserve governor, on allegations of mortgage fraud. Cook denies the allegations. Her lawyers say she never committed mortgage fraud. The investigation creates pressure on another voting member of the Federal Open Market Committee, which sets interest rates. June 2025. Powell testifies before the Senate Banking Committee about the Fed's headquarters renovation. He explains the project's scope, the cost increases, the timeline. Republican senators responding to White House criticism grill him about the overruns. January 10, 2026. The Department of Justice serves the Federal Reserve with grand jury subpoenas. The investigation focuses on whether Powell lied to the Senate about the building renovation. U.S. Attorney Jeanine Pirro, a longtime Trump ally, now running the D.C. Federal Prosecutor's Office, signed off on the probe. Trump, when asked by NBC News, says he doesn't know anything about it. Quote, "I don't know anything about it, but he's certainly not very good at the Fed, and he's not very good at building buildings." January 11th, 2026. Sunday night. Jerome Powell releases a video statement. He doesn't just respond to the allegations. He reframes the entire investigation as political retaliation for the Fed's independence. Quote, "On Friday, the Department of Justice served the Federal Reserve with grand jury subpoenas, threatening a criminal indictment related to my testimony before the Senate Banking Committee last June. No one, certainly not the chair of the Federal Reserve, is above the law. But this unprecedented action should be seen in the broader context of the administration's threats and ongoing pressure." Then he says the building renovation is a pretext. The real issue is monetary policy. Quote, "This is about whether the Fed will be able to continue to set interest rates based on evidence and economic conditions, or whether instead monetary policy will be directed by political pressure or intimidation." That's an extraordinary statement. The chair of the Federal Reserve publicly accusing the President's Justice Department of using criminal prosecution to control interest rates. Within hours, something unexpected happens. Republican senators start breaking ranks. Senator Thom Tillis of North Carolina, a member of the Senate Banking Committee, announces he will oppose confirmation of any Trump nominee for the Federal Reserve, including the next Fed chair, until the investigation is resolved. Quote, "If there were any remaining doubt whether advisors within the Trump administration are actively pushing to end the independence of the Federal Reserve, there should now be none." Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska joins him. Quote, "It's clear the administration's investigation is nothing more than an attempt at coercion. These aren't moderate Republicans. These aren't never-Trumpers. These are senators from red states who generally support the president's agenda. And they're publicly calling this an attack on institutional independence." Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren says the Senate shouldn't move forward with any Trump Fed nominee. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer calls it bullying and an assault on economic stability. By January 13, Jamie Dimon, CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase, warns that the investigation threatens Fed independence. Former Federal Reserve officials call it lawfare. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent privately tells Trump the probe could complicate confirming the next Fed chair. January 14. Trump doubles down. He calls Powell either incompetent or crooked. Quote, "He's billions of dollars over budget, so he either is incompetent or he's crooked. I don't know what he is." January 30. Trump nominates Kevin Warsh, a former Fed governor, to replace Powell when his term expires in May. Senator Tillis immediately announces he will oppose the nomination until the investigation ends. Because Tillis sits on the Senate Banking Committee, which has 13 Republicans and 11 Democrats, his single vote creates a stalemate. Without his support, the nomination can't get a committee recommendation. That's the timeline. Now watch what it reveals about institutional power and political pressure. From a legal perspective, investigating a Federal Reserve chair for congressional testimony about building costs is unprecedented. Not because officials can't be investigated, but because the stated justification and the obvious motive are so completely disconnected. The DOJ says this is about whether Powell misled Congress about a renovation project. But Powell's June testimony was public. The cost increases were documented. The Fed brought in its own inspector general to review the project after Trump criticized it. There's no secret here. The Justice Department spokesperson says Attorney General Pam Bondi instructed prosecutors to prioritize investigating abuse of taxpayer dollars. But the Federal Reserve doesn't use taxpayer money. It's self-funded through fees on banking services and its investment portfolio. This is publicly available information. So the legal justification doesn't match the basic facts. What does match is the pattern. Trump wants lower interest rates. The Fed won't comply on his timeline. Trump attacks Powell publicly for months. The DOJ investigates a Fed governor on mortgage fraud allegations. The pressure escalates. Then the DOJ threatens criminal indictment of the chair himself. Powell's statement makes the connection explicit. This isn't about construction. This is about interest rates. Here's what they're not telling you. This creates a precedent that fundamentally changes the relationship between the executive branch and independent agencies. The Federal Reserve is supposed to be insulated from political pressure. So is the Justice Department. The entire point of making these institutions independent is so they can make decisions based on law, evidence, and economics, rather than political expediency. But if the Justice Department answers to the President, and the President wants to control monetary policy, then the DOJ becomes the enforcement mechanism for presidential preferences. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's what Powell is directly alleging. And Republican senators are agreeing with him. Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, typically a Trump ally, said, "If you wanted to design a system to guarantee that interest rates would go up and not down, the best way to do that would be to have the Federal Reserve and the executive branch of the United States get in a pissing contest. We need this like we need a hole in the head." That's a Republican senator saying this investigation is counterproductive, even for Trump's stated goal of lower rates. Because here's the hidden dynamic. When you threaten the Fed chair with criminal prosecution, you create uncertainty in financial markets. Uncertainty raises risk. Risk makes investors nervous. Nervous investors demand higher returns. Higher returns mean higher interest rates. By trying to force Powell to lower rates through intimidation, Trump is creating the conditions for rates to stay higher. But there's a deeper calculation. Powell's term as Fed chair ends in May 2026. Trump has already said he has a replacement in mind. The assumption was Powell would leave the board entirely when his term as chair ended, following tradition. But Powell's term as a Fed governor doesn't expire until January 2028. He could technically stay on the board for nearly 2 more years. As a governor, he would still have a vote on interest rates. And after this public confrontation, he has every incentive to stay. That means even if Trump gets his nominee confirmed as the next chair, Powell remains on the board as a powerful voice for Fed independence. Trump doesn't just fail to remove him, he ensures Powell becomes a longer-term obstacle. The investigation has already complicated Trump's ability to get a replacement confirmed. Senator Tillis's opposition creates a problem in committee. If other Republicans follow his lead, the nomination could fail entirely. So Trump faces a choice: drop the investigation and lose the intimidation pressure, continue the investigation, and potentially lose the ability to confirm a loyalist. This has implications that extend far beyond monetary policy. If the Justice Department can threaten criminal charges against the Fed chair for making economic decisions the president disagrees with, what other independent officials are vulnerable? Inspectors general who find fraud in executive agencies? independent counsels investigating executive branch misconduct, regulatory commissioners who enforce laws against presidential preferences. The pattern is clear. Institutional independence only exists as long as officials are willing to risk criminal prosecution to maintain it. Powell called the DOJ's bluff. He released a video statement accusing the administration of weaponizing criminal law for political purposes. He made clear he won't resign under pressure, and he framed this as a choice between evidence-based policy and political intimidation. That puts enormous pressure on Republicans in the Senate. Do they confirm Trump's next Fed chair while Powell is under criminal investigation for refusing to follow presidential preferences? Or do they defend institutional independence even when it contradicts their party's leader? So far, at least 2 Republican senators have chosen independence. That number could grow. Meanwhile, the investigation continues. The DOJ hasn't backed down, Powell hasn't resigned, and the precedent is being set in real time. So where does this go? Powell's term as chair expires in May. Trump will nominate a replacement. That nominee will face a Senate that's divided not just between parties, but within the Republican caucus itself. If the investigation continues, more Republicans may join Tillis and Murkowski in opposition. If Trump drops the investigation, he signals that institutional resistance works and invites more of it. If Powell stays on the board after his term as chair ends, he becomes a permanent voice against political control of the Fed. If he leaves, it signals that criminal threats are effective at removing officials who resist. This moment isn't about interest rates. It's not even about Jerome Powell. This moment is about whether independent institutions can survive political pressure backed by criminal prosecution. The precedent being set right now will define the limits of executive power for the next administration and the one after that. Because once the Justice Department becomes a weapon for political control of independent agencies, there's no institutional barrier left. Watch what happens next. Because the confirmation vote for Trump's next Fed chair nominee, the outcome of the DOJ investigation, and Powell's decision about staying on the board will all determine whether Federal Reserve independence was a feature of American government or just a norm that ended in January 2026. And institutions don't collapse in a single moment. They erode through precedents that make the next breach easier. One investigation at a time. One threatened indictment at a time. One official who resists and one official who doesn't. The Federal Reserve was designed to be independent. The Justice Department was designed to be independent. The question now is whether design matters when the political will to enforce it disappears. This moment matters.